Hello again, Ed 550 teachers. This is your PE integration plan video tour. And since the PE integration plan is very similar, if not almost identical to the health integration plan, I'm not going to be going over the actual PE integration plan template. It's the same, and if you still have questions about how to fill out that template, I would advise you to go back to the health integration plan video. But I'm going to spend this video going over 3 exemplars from your colleagues on the health integration plan that I think will help us to look at general lesson planning and thinking about the flow of a lesson and thinking about how things align, say, between the standard, the learning objective, and the assessment. And I think this will not only be helpful for your PE integration plan, but for your general lesson planning for CSUMB, eventually for EdTPA, when you need to do your lesson planning for EdTPA, and just general lesson planning, as a full-time teacher when you finally get there. And I'm sure most of the other lecturers at CSUMB are telling you this, but this level of detail in planning and this, the amount of words and the amount of information and planning that goes into these lesson plans is not typical for a classroom teacher. It's not typical for it to be written down, but really good teachers engage in these practices all the time. And when you're working with your teaching placement, or for those of you who have been teaching or subbing before, you'll get a chance to see what that kind of planning looks like on the ground. But the purpose of this approach to planning is not to, teach you some ideal way of planning. It's to really get you going through the motions of thinking about all the small things that make a really good and really effective lesson plan. And there's so many factors to consider, including student responses and how do we assess and where do we start? What is the base of our lesson plan? There's so many factors, and I won't be able to go over them all in this lesson, in this video, but I think the information is going to be helpful for you, and I hope it improves your lesson planning while you're in the program. So going down to day 16 in the physical education integration plan link, I included these samples here. There's a kindergarten, a grade 4, and then a grade 6 ELA plan. I've removed the students' names. They've all given me permission. I've chosen these 2 lesson plans mostly because they're very good, but they're not perfect, right? They still have some areas where they could have improved and they could have extended the learning, and we'll go over that a little bit. And I'm going to talk about each of them, not in great detail, but just in a little detail as demonstration of how you can effectively plan these integration plans and general lesson planning overall. So you may have seen this before, and you may have talked about this in 611. I assume that you have, or if you haven't, then you definitely will in some classes coming up. This is what we call the gradual release of responsibility. And this kind of approach to teaching and approach to teacher education is a kind of a keystone of what we're doing here at CSUMB. And I think it's a really good way to think about the flow of a lesson. So in our PE and health integration plans, we're only planning introduction, practice, and assessment, right? That's not, there's other ways to plan a lesson, right? But in this course, the way we're structuring integration, we're focusing on how do we introduce the content, how do we practice the content, or concepts, excuse me, and how are we going to assess it? And this gradual release of responsibility, I think, is a really good way to think about that, not only for this plan, but for your general planning when you become a teacher. So the structure of a gradual release of responsibility is these 2 triangles, right? And meaning it starts from top to bottom and moves its way down. So as the lesson progresses, or the unit progresses, but in this case, the single lesson, the teacher's responsibility starts being the most. The teachers have the most responsibility at this point. And then as the lesson continues, the student's responsibility, represented by this triangle here, gets bigger and bigger. So it starts from more of a general, which we call the I do it phase, right? Where the teacher is focusing the lesson, the teacher is introducing the concepts. They're engaging with the students with an activity that introduces and activates that prior knowledge related to the topic or to the concept, to the content, or the skills. In a lot of the plans you're going to see today, this starts with like a discussion, right? And the teacher asks a kind of guiding question, and it gets the students talking in partners or in groups, or it's a whole group. Or there's a hands-on activity where the students try something and get them thinking about it. But the responsibility here at the lesson is mostly on the teacher. The teacher is the one who's leading that and kind of holding the reins of the lesson here. And the next part is the we do, or the we do it. So usually we say I do, we do, but the we do, and this we is everybody. This is the teacher and the students together. And this is what you might also call this guided instruction. And this is also part of the introduction. So these two parts here are essentially part of the introduction. I would say there's some overlap into practice sometimes, but during this guided instruction, as we do it, the teacher is still kind of engaging in this kind of shared learning, this learning together, but is guided by the teacher. So, where the teacher might be starting a discussion, the students are responding to the questions, the teacher is responding back. Maybe the teacher is modeling here. So this would be a point where the teacher might model that skill and show them, hey, this is what we're doing. This is how we do it. This is a pretty important part here where the teacher is showing it, the students are practicing it together. It's very much guided by the teacher. The next part, the you do it together. This is a collaborative part, right? And this is where the students are working together in partners or groups to kind of practice that skill that was just introduced during this guided instruction section. So there is still a lot of feedback from the teacher here. There's feedback, there's clearing up misconceptions, the students are sharing their answers out. It's not just contained in their little group, it comes back to the class, and the teacher facilitates this whole process. And in the end, the teacher helps to synthesize that student learning. So, if we go back to I do, we had a student discussion, a group discussion about the topic here. And then the teacher is introducing it more directly and modeling this is how we do this skill or this content. And then here the students are practicing it and trying it and experimenting with it in groups and pairs. And they share their ideas out with the rest of the group, and the teacher kind of synthesizes that together. This is the practice here. This is the kind of core of the practice here. This is where the students are practicing it with feedback from you as the teacher or feedback from peers. It ends with a synthesis of the teacher kind of bringing everything together. Finally, the you do it, or the you do it alone, is the assessment. This is where the students, and in our case, individually, are doing it on their own. There's no feedback really provided here. There's no checking in and guiding the students, aside from scaffolds and supports that might be in place. This is where you are asking the students to do it by themselves. And this is what you will collect or use as your assessment data for individual students. Many of you, and the exemplar that I shared in the health integration plan, during the practice activities, collaborative time, you took observations of students talking and you assessed from that. And that's fine. And I include that as the exemplar because it is fine. But in almost all cases, it's always going to be better to have an independent activity, an additional activity where the students do it by themselves. And that serves as their assessment artifact that provides you data to measure how well they achieved towards the standard and learning objective that you chose. So again, it starts with a kind of very teacher-focused, introducing the topic, activating prior knowledge. Then there's some teacher modeling, showing what it is, explaining what it means. This could be through direct instruction, or it could be some student inquiry here. And then there's the collaborative learning, where students work in pairs and groups and practice it and explore it more together. There's lots of feedback from the teacher. There's clearing up misconceptions from the teacher. And there's eventually a synthesis where the teacher brings it all together. And there's a lot of sharing out as well. But the focus is on practicing that skill. And then finally, the assessment is the independent work down here. So we have the introduction up here, the I do and we do. The practice is the collaborative, the you do it together. And the assessment is the independent, you do it alone. And this is the basic flow of a lesson. We'll look at it in some of these examples in a moment. But this is really an important way, I think, for you all to think about how do I structure a lesson? Rather than, okay, I'm going to show you this video and then I want you to practice this thing on your own. And then, okay, I'm going to use that thing that you practice in the group as the assessment. This has a clear flow and a clear structure to it. Ideally, if you think about it, the students will have been introduced to the material here. They'll have seen somebody do it, the teacher, you have modeled it here really clearly. Then they've had a chance to practice it, they've had a chance to practice it together in a group here. And then by the time they get to the assessment, they've already seen it 1, 2, or 3 times before they're actually asked to do it. So we don't ever want to really jump into assessing the students without having done any instruction. And instruction is not always teachers telling you exactly what to do. I mean, that's direct instruction, and that's an effective way to do a lot of teaching, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that time where they're working together to practice it and experiment with it and then get feedback from you as a teacher is equally important. And for some things, it's even more important because it gives the students a chance to actually try it rather than just watching somebody do it. So this is the general flow. Introduction here, practice here, and assessment here. So for your PE integration plans, I'm really looking for an attention to this flow. You don't have to use this language, okay, now we're going to do the I do or the we do, but I want to see that in your lesson plans to show that you're thinking about an effective way to make sure to structure opportunities for the students to not only see the material and hear about it from you, but also to practice it together and then do it by themselves alone for the assessment. That's what I'm really looking for in your plans. Okay, so let's look at some examples which I think will help clear this up a little bit. We'll start with the kindergarten plan. This is a kindergarten plan that used the pumpkin patch ELA lesson. And I'll scroll down to the pumpkin patch lesson a little bit. But essentially, students go on a field trip to the pumpkin patch, and then this lesson is them coming back and recalling personal events. So the learning objective for this was they'll be able to retell their experiences during the visit to the pumpkin patch using keywords. So this is the ELA lesson. They go on a field trip to the pumpkin patch, they come back, and then they have to retell that story, the experience. Now this person, they've decided to focus on naming the standard here, name and describe the 5 senses. So this is the standard that they chose. And I'm starting with the standard here, and this document starts with the standard here as well, because this is the foundation for all of your planning. A lot of times I think teachers tend to think about it backwards, especially true in the early years, right? They think about, okay, I want to do this unit on apples, or I want to do I got to do my butterfly unit. And then they plan all these great activities, and then they go back and say, okay, what standards does that hit? And they take off the standards, and they just dump a bunch of standards in here. When in reality, the learning is a way to teach and assess the standard. Standard is not something that you kind of a label that you put onto the learning. The learning comes from and is built from and upon the standard itself. So ideally, you want to see this standard really throughout the whole plan. And this is true not only for here at us at CSUMB, but for EdTPA as well too. And in general, this is an effective plan. Standards have been researched and they've been decided by California. These are required for students to know. So when you're planning your lessons, this is how you tell what you want. This is how you decide what students are to learn. And you really build your planning and your assessment around the standard. For our integration plan, and for your future lesson plans, the 3 areas where that standard should really be visible, of course, is it here in the standard, but that should also be aligned with the learning objective and the assessment. So there should be really, really clear alignment between these 3 factors. And that really clear alignment helps for better planning, more effective instruction, and accurate assessment. So you can say when you get down to the assessment that, hey, I've taught the skills that are required for this standard. uh, as I communicated in my learning objective, and I'm directly assessing them in this assessment activity. So let's look at what this teacher has done here. So they chose the standard name and describe the 5 senses. The learning objective says students will be able to name and describe the 5 senses. Okay, that's directly taken from the standard. That's usually a good sign for me. We'll be able to name and describe the 5 senses by retelling how they use these senses in the pumpkin patch in an oral presentation with a partner or teacher. This is probably the best learning objective that I've seen of all the plans. Not only is it really clearly aligned with the standard, but it's very measurable. I mean, you will easily be able to decide, are students able to name the 5 senses? I mean, it's simple, it's a yes or no, and we don't want to just focus on like really closed assessments, like yes, they know this, or no, they don't. But there's also a description, which is also measurable, and we can measure that at a range of achievement, right? How well they assess it, how well they describe it, or how accurately they describe it. So not only is it aligned with the standard, but it's very clear and very measurable. And this teacher also said how they're going to do it. Now, if they had just said students will be able to name and describe the 5 senses, that's fine. But a really good lesson plan, a really good learning objective not only says what's the measurable action here, what's the measurable action that we're looking for, and how will the students do it by retelling how they use their senses in the pumpkin patch, and the actual format of that in an oral presentation with a partner or teacher. So really super, super clear. And you can go over this more in your other classes, but this is a really, really great a learning objective. Very clear, very measurable, and very much aligned with the standard. Now I'm going to scroll down to the assessment. Just take a look to see if that lines up with the standard here, name and describe the 5 senses. So if this was a good assessment, I should be able to see right away that whatever the teacher is measuring, and however they're measuring it, there's a chance for the students to name and describe the 5 senses. So I'm going to scroll down here. And here's the assessment. So I'm going to look right at the rubric here. And this is a holistic rubric, meaning that all of the criteria are kind of in one box rather than being split up into different rows. But it says objectives met. Students can orally name all the senses. They can give examples and descriptions of what they drew or wrote. The student does not need prompting to recall the senses. Okay, very, very clear. I would probably say it's probably better to go with an analytic rubric where we split up all 3 of these. So this is one row. Students can orally name the senses. Students can orally name all the senses with prompting. Student is not able to name all the senses. That's one row. And the next row says they can give examples and descriptions of what they drew or wrote. The student needs prompting to give examples, description of what they drew or wrote. The student needs prompting to give examples of what they drew or wrote. I would maybe say this could use some work here, saying the student is unable or student struggles to give examples of and descriptions of what they drew or wrote. And you can like prompting is also a really great way to kind of describe a range of achievement here, but by separating it into, in this case, two criteria, can they name the senses, and can they describe the senses, what they drew or wrote, then we get a better and more detailed kind of range of assessment data. So we'll be able to tell that, okay, student A, they can orally name all the senses, but they really struggle to describe them. So I know that if I'm going to teach student A, I'm going to reteach, I got to focus on description. But maybe there's a student that just really does a great job just describing, but they don't know the names of the senses. So we can know from this, if this was split into two rows, 2 criteria, we could know that, okay, this student B can describe really well, but they can't name the senses. Okay, so we need to reteach them how to name the senses. So it gives you more data, it gives you a wider range of data, it helps you make better decisions, and a more accurate assessment of the student's achievement towards the standard. In this example, I'll go through the lesson briefly here, but that alignment between the standard, the learning objective, and the assessment is very clear. The standard is obviously driving the whole plan here. And that language comes up all over the place, right? So it's very visible, it's very present in all of them. And that won't always be the case. I mean, sometimes this is like, sometimes this is very simple standard, right? Like, identify healthy food. And that's fine to just identify healthy food, but maybe the teacher wants to take it to the next level and they want to not just identify, but they want them to identify healthy foods and explain why they're good for their diet, for example. And that's fine to bump it up, to increase the complexity a little bit, or the depth of learning. That's totally fine. But definitely you want to have some kind of connection between the two. And so for your PE lesson plans, if I go to the standards here, and I'll look at kindergarten, some of them, explain the difference between under and over, behind and out. This is explain, right? So we want them to explain. This one says identify and independently use personal space, general space, and boundaries, and discuss why they're important. There's a lot here. We have identify, use, discuss. It's perfectly fine if we're using this one to focus on just one or two of them. You wouldn't have to fit all of them. That's not, you might go for it, and I think you probably could in this case, but you don't have to hit all of the verbs. But there's really clear things that you could do here. But for some of like the locomotor movement, perform a continuous log roll. Okay, I'm imagining like a whole room of kindergartners rolling on the floor, and it's making me laugh right now. But this is a pretty closed assessment. If your assessment is students will be able to perform a continuous log roll, okay, we could probably do a little bit more than that, right? We might be able to tie in another locomotor skill, or students will be able to perform a continuous log roll forward and backward, as well as jump over a stationary rope several times in succession. So we might have another standard here, just because this is a very closed assessment. So you want to really think about the standard that you choose. If it's a super like yes or no, they can do this thing or they can't, and it's only one thing like this, a continuous log roll, you might want to reconsider how you can stretch that a little bit further here. And I think, thinking about what the theme is can be helpful too. Okay, so let's go back to the kindergarten lesson plan here. So as I talked about in the gradual release of responsibility, let's go back to that graphic here. It should start in the introduction with a very teacher kind of focused introducing, getting the students started thinking about the content, which is naming and describing the 5 senses here. So let's look at this teacher's introduction. So we have big pictures of the senses on the board. There's a question that starts it. Does anyone know what the 5 senses are? Really clear planning, clear information here as students give out information. And then the teacher really clearly models all the 5 senses: seeing, hearing, and this teacher did a wonderful job of really highlighting what the teacher's actions are, their dialogue. I mean, it's a very, very detailed plan. But they go through all of the 5 senses. And this introduction becomes quite long because, well, not only are they introducing it to that discussion, but there's that guided instruction, that modeling really clearly here of the teacher showing, hey, see. And the teacher points to their eyes and make imaginary binoculars. We see people and things with our eyes. For example, yesterday, okay? So really clearly modeling this skill, which is to name and describe the 5 senses. And the introduction really clearly goes through that really well. In the practice, so this is before they get on the school bus to go to the pumpkin patch. So this teacher gives them a worksheet that they'll be working on at the pumpkin patch. So I'll go down to the worksheet here, and this is what it is. Got the 5 senses there. And this teacher planned that the practice happens during the field trip. So on their own or in pairs, I can't remember, the students go around and they engage in these practices, right? So they are collaborating together and practicing the 5 senses. And the teacher is there giving feedback, point out certain things, have them explain them to you. The teacher has clear instructions for who are ELLs, and how we're going to support them. There's a really clear plan. And it's not super long here. but there's a clear plan of the students practicing that skill with a chance for the teacher to give feedback on that. And then at the end, the assessment is they come back after the pumpkin patch. And again, this is the independent time where they do it by themselves. The teacher has them come up in groups of 4 and describe to their partner what they did yesterday using the 5 senses worksheet. So they use the practice worksheet here as from the practice section to kind of orally describe what they saw. And then the teacher uses this rubric to assess their ability to orally name all the senses and give examples and descriptions of what they drew or wrote. So again, we have this really clear flow. The teacher is focusing the lesson and is explaining and saying, guiding them with a guiding question in the beginning and really clearly modeling it. And then this we do also with modeling, but there's student contribution and student discussion as well in this guided instruction. Again, this is the introduction. And then the practice has them actually doing it and practicing it on the field trip, practicing naming and describing the 5 senses on the field trip. And then they come back and they try it by themselves on their own. I would say this assessment could be improved if it was an additional activity. For me, they're not really, just reading off and remembering is fine. And they can name the senses, but maybe if the student is able to read, that might be a kind of giveaway with this assessment. So I would say having another activity back at the school where they engage in a sensory activity and then they give their feedback from that, which means it's an almost exact same activity they did here, but just independently, might be a better way to assess it. But again, this was perfectly fine, and I can really imagine this working very well in a kindergarten classroom. The teacher is not asking them to write. There's a lot of drawing and illustrations. If they're able to write, they can. It's kindergarten. Most of them will not be able to write. And the teacher does a really good job of not making writing a required part of the assessment, right? So they remove any barriers that might prevent the teacher from getting a good understanding of what the student's achievement is towards the standard. If this was to say, oh, students can write all the 5 sentences or students can name all the 5 senses in writing, then that puts up a barrier to any students who are unable to write or spell. Maybe they do know the names of the 5 sentences, but if the task is for them to write it, that's a barrier that prevents you, the teacher, from really getting a better understanding of their achievement towards the standard. So this sample is in the PE integration plan assignment. I would highly encourage you to have a look through. Next, look at a grade 4 lesson. This is an ELA lesson. And this was the ELA lesson that used Cinderella or Cinderelli. And the learning objective was students will be able to identify the hero or villain of a chosen story by using explicit details and evidence from the text regarding character traits. So this teacher did a really great job of thinking, okay, well, we're looking at the story of Cinderella or Cinderelli. It's like a spoof on the story. And they're talking about heroes and villains. Okay, what standard can I really hit with that? And they looked at the grade 4 standards and they found, okay, there's this great one here, offer friendship and support to someone who's bullied. So obviously this teacher was thinking about the content of the story and what are the topics that might come up in that discussion of heroes and villains and of Cinderella. And so this is a great example of a standard that would be pretty hard to measure. If you really objectively wanted to measure this, then is a student able to offer friendship and support to someone who is bullied? That means someone would have to be bullied and you'd have to observe and assess their ability to offer friendship and support. Obviously, we're not going to do that. So we've got to think about ways that we can kind of create that environment where we can check and test that of students' ability to do that. The student wrote 2 learning objectives. So you only write 1. So there's 2, and we'll look at both of them and see which one we think is better. But the first one says students will be able to identify and show support to an individual who's a victim of bullying. So again, we have support, we have show support. I'd say it's close to offer support. And I think by identify, they mean like identify bullying. And then the second learning objective says students will be able to give support and show kindness to an individual who was bullied. So both of these are really, you know, identify and show support to an individual who is a victim of bullying. Students will be able to give support and show kindness to an individual who is bullied. They're both good, but I think we can make them a little bit better by saying students will be able to explain how to offer friendship and support to someone who is bullied. Okay, the word explain here takes it out of the real experience, which this is still kind of asking. And of course, you know, it's a bit pedantic. I understand that. Of course, you're not expecting them to like actually have to give support and show kindness to someone who's actually bullied, but you really want to make sure that the verbs that you're choosing here, right? Students will be able to give support. Like, can you measure that? Okay, I would say that's pretty hard to measure. And if you have to further explain it, like, well, okay, we're not actually giving support, but they're explaining how, then that's your verb. That's your action here. Okay, students will be able to explain how to give support and show kindness, or students will be able to explain how to identify bullying and show support to an individual who's a victim of bullying. Okay, so we can improve this learning objective, but we have a lot of the same language here: show, offer, support, give, support, offer, support, show kindness, offer friendship to someone who is bullied. So it's a very clear connection. Let's go down to the assessment. Here's a rubric again. Students able to, here's the meeting standard. Student is able to fully identify both the individual being bullied and the individual offering their support and friendship. So we have the verb identify here. So I would say we're missing maybe, and if we go back to my suggested objective, missing explain, right? But a student is able to fully identify who the individual being bullied and explain how they would offer support and friendship. I would split this into two rows like I did for the last plan. First row is, are they able to identify when someone's being bullied? And the second row is, are they able to explain how they would offer support and friendship to someone who's being bullied? And that gives us a wider range of assessment. Let's look at the flow of the lesson here. So we should be starting with a good kind of introduction, guiding question. Maybe there's an activity or something to get them thinking about this idea of bullying. And sure enough, this teacher did a really great job of introducing a personal story about them being bullied, and gets the students talking about it. And there's guiding questions, right? Let's see here, what's the question here? So the teacher will tell a story which shows someone being bullied, but someone comes along and helps them out. As a result, a friendship between the bullied victim and the individual who gave support. After the students have the story, have the students turn to their elbow partners and discuss the story with each other. They must try to figure out who was being bullied and who came in to help out. Okay, again, I think this is a great activity to start with the story, an anecdote that gets them thinking about the topic, but you haven't necessarily explicitly said, hey, we're talking about bullies here, and so pay attention to bullies, right? It's a story that gets them thinking about it, maybe connecting with their own experiences. I would say there should be some really more clear guiding questions here. What exactly are you going to ask the students to talk about in their partners? But this is a great introduction that gets them thinking and talking about it. Once the students have, and then again here, once the students have a good understanding, teacher will put the students in groups that have already been pre-selected. So before that, teacher explains the scenario. This is that modeling here. It's the kind of modeling with the group of explaining scenario, who was bullied, how they were offered support, and really kind of offers this teacher modeling here. In the practice section, students get in groups, they get scripts from Cinderella, right? And then they analyze the scripts, and there's really great guiding questions this teacher has included. They analyze these scenes in Cinderella where someone is being bullied or offered support. And these guiding questions are how they respond in the group. So the students are collaboratively practicing this very skill, right, of identifying who's being bullied and thinking about how they would offer them support. So they're practicing it in their groups, in groups of 2, 3, or 4, I don't remember, and really practicing it. The teacher is floating around, offering feedback, and then And at the end, students share their answers out. The teacher writes them on the board. This is that great synthesis, synthesizing the students' ideas together. The teacher is able to clear up misconceptions and to really kind of solidify and synthesize all that learning and practice that they did about identifying bullies and describing how they would support. So really, really great practice here. During the assessment, they're just doing literally the same thing again with a different script. And now they're doing it on their own. So that's it. They're doing the exact same activity they did in groups after they've shared their ideas out and the teacher facilitated that discussion and gave feedback and synthesized everything together. Now the teacher says, okay, do it again on your own with a different script. And then they just do it in writing. This is a grade 4 unit, so the writing is a perfectly reasonable medium to answer. And then this rubric will be used to assess their writing. So really, really clear assessment, really, really great flow from the introduction to the practice to the assessment. And it's simple, really, when you think about it. I mean, this practice activity, they're doing it in groups here. Now they're just doing it on their own. And that is more than enough. And that is really what this flow is all about here. The goal is not to catch students making mistakes. The goal is to give them as much support and guidance into doing it right. So when it comes time to do the assessment, there's very little chance that they will not be able to do it properly. And if they don't do it properly, then you have really, really great data to see, okay, this part of my lesson didn't work really well, or this part of the lesson didn't really stick with the student, or the student is still struggling with this part. And you can be confident that, oh, I practiced it, we did it together, I showed them, they practiced it in groups, I gave feedback. You gave them every opportunity to do it right and to do it well, and they still weren't able to do it, then you know, okay, I gotta adjust my teaching here. And that's really what it's all about. It's not about catching students making mistakes. It's about giving them as many opportunities to practice it with a lot of support. So high challenge and high support. And then when it comes time to the assessment, it would be like a no-brainer for them, essentially. Look at one more quickly. I don't want this video to be too long. It's a grade 6 ELA plan. And this is a lesson that's looking at the LORAX, and it's a science and ELA lesson. The learning objective is identify global climate change and the possible impacts of human activity by brainstorming ideas in order to select a research topic. So in this lesson, you look at the story of the LORAX and as a kind of segue into talking about global climate change. In the health integration plan, this is so creative, I really like this lesson a lot. The standard this teacher chose was describe situations for which someone should seek help with stress, loss, and depression. So essentially, the teacher thought about, okay, the story of the Lorax, I know that really well. The Lorax loses his whole forest, so we can use that as a kind of talking point to look at and identify and describe situations when someone should seek help with stress, loss, and depression. So here's our verb here. We should really be able to see this in the learning objective. And of course, we can. Students will be able to identify and describe situations for which someone should seek help with stress, loss, and depression. I mean, it's literally the words from the standard, which is totally fine. Maybe they can add some more detail on how that's going to happen in this lesson in response to in a short writing response to the Lorax or whatever the description is here. But this is very, very clear, measurable, identify and describe. This is more of closed. Are they able to identify it? Yes or no. But this is more of an open, right? There's more range of achievement here. Let's go down to the assessment. Great rubric here. This is the rubric this teacher has organized it by criteria, right? So this row represents, are they able to annotate signs of stress, loss, or depression in the scenario? And there's a range here. Are they able to label a scenario as stress or depression? And there's a range here. And are they able to describe? So here's the identify, these two, and here's the describe. The achieving is students identifies, there's the word, and annotates all signs of stress, loss, or depression. Student correctly labels a given scenario as stress or depression. They're pretty close here. There's probably a way to collapse these into one. And any time that you have two criteria that the students that are mutually exclusive, so meaning that they have to, if you get a 3 here, then you're automatically going to get a 3 here. and there's no chance of them getting a different score, then there's probably a sign the assessment can be tightened up, but there's repeated information here. And the last one, the description, student adequately describes a new situation for which someone should seek help with stress, loss, and depression. Adequately, it provides situation, but it does not include adequate description, and student does not write their own description. So really, really clear rubric that's very much connected to not only the learning objective, but the standard as well. Let's look at the lesson quickly. So at the end of the lesson, after they've read the Lorax, the teacher gives some handouts, and the handouts this teacher has attached to this lesson plan. They're kind of screenshots from a YouTube reading of the book, and gets the students talking about comparing and contrasting what's happening in the story. So, this kind of jumps a little bit too quickly into the we do, right, into this part here. I would say there's probably, there can be a better introduction here where the teacher is kind of prompting them with a guiding question or getting them thinking about connecting it to their own lives, or really kind of starting that introduction, but it's not that. There's a discussion here. The teacher is kind of facilitating, the teacher is kind of giving some examples of what the life with the Lorax is like, and life without the Lorax. The teacher is modeling that here. And then the teacher gives out and explains and teaches, these are signs of stress. And the teacher puts them up on the board, right? And so here's this guided instruction, right? Here's this really clear modeling from the teacher, excuse me. Where here's signs of stress and here's signs of depression, really clear. I would say there could be some more detail here on how we're going to explain these or how we're going to model them, but it's a fine start. For the practice, teacher hands out small pieces of paper that given scenarios common at school or home. So we've moved from beyond the Lorax now into a different scenario. The students, in this practice activity, the students are working by themselves, I'm pretty sure, working by themselves to practice the skill, right? To practice identifying the signs of stress or depression, and practice writing what they would do to offer support. And then as they're going, teachers circulating and helping and supporting. And then what they do for this assignment is use as the assessment. This is not a really great idea to use the practice as an assessment, because you've given so much feedback. Ideally, you've been giving feedback and you've been guiding the students and you've been clearing up misconceptions. So if you use that as the assessment, then the problem is now you don't know, is this the reflection of the student's individual ability and achievement, or is this a reflection of my support that I've given them on that practice activity? And the same goes for group work too. It's difficult to use group work as individual assessment. It's not impossible, and it's not like you can't assess group work. You can, but if you really want to be able to say, this is what this student achieved towards the standard, it has to be an independent activity, right? And sometimes that's just a matter of like having them write a reflection of what they did in their group work, right? And explaining whatever the standard is, it is group work, and reflecting on it individually, and then you assess that, and that's totally fine. But in this case, again, I don't think it's great to use the practice. And I would say that this really great description that the teacher has written out, this goes in the assessment, the individual activity where they're replying to a scenario and responding to a scenario. That's the assessment. What would be a better practice activity here would be to have students working in pairs to respond to scenarios. And maybe that's from more scenarios from the Lorax, or is from a different story that they're familiar with, right? Where they have to identify the signs of stress or depression, and as a group decide how would they offer support to that person or that character. And then again, that those students work and practice, teacher would circle around, give feedback. Each group would then share their ideas out. And what's great is if it was like this, if everyone was doing the same story or a couple stories, then you get a nice debate of people, explaining, say, well, I think this is depression because, there's a lack of interest in events and hobbies. And so, but yeah, that's true. But they have difficulty making decisions. So maybe it's stress, and you really get them debating and engaging in a really productive conversation and discussion that you can help facilitate. And then, of course, for something like describe solutions, if every group has a different description of the solution and they're all good, or maybe some are not good, maybe some are a little bit off the mark, but that really helps to the students to hear and to practice different ways of engaging in the standard of describing how you offer friendship or support. And as a teacher, you're taking all these ideas in, you're facilitating the discussion, and then of course you're synthesizing it together before they really get into this individual activity here in the assessment. And they've already done it, they've practiced it, they've gone through the same process, they've seen you do it as a teacher, they've done it with their group, they've heard other groups explain it, they've heard your feedback and synthesis, and now it's time for them to do it. It's like it's easy, it's a clean shot for them, able to do it really well. And you know, again, as I said, none of these 3 lessons, they're not all perfect. They have room for improvement, just like everybody's lesson does, but they all demonstrate really great qualities of a good lesson plan, whether that is an alignment between the standard, the learning objective, and the assessment, or a clear flow through that introduction, practice, and assessment. They all really do a great job demonstrating that. So your basic job now is to take your own lesson plan, right? Not one of the sample plans, your own lesson plan. And ideally, this is the one that you wrote in 611, but it can be any CSUMB formatted lesson plan that you have. If you've done one before for a different class, or you're working on one, that's fine. What I don't want you to do is I don't want you to have to write another CSUMB lesson plan. Okay, I want you to use one that's already made. I want you to put your energy into the integration, not into the actual content lesson plan. And it can be in any content. Obviously, it's not a PE lesson, right? We're not integrating PE into PE, but it's your own lesson plan that you've written. Maybe it's ELA, maybe it's math, maybe it's science or social studies, or music, or art. I'm not sure. It's up to you, but whatever lesson plan that you have, and go to the PE standards and think about what's the grade that you're teaching. So I'll go on a different grade now. Let's say you're teaching grade 2. And you have a plan, an ELA plan that has them, I don't know, looking at words that end with ing, okay? And you've worked really hard on this lesson plan, and it's very focused on morphology, right? Words with ing ending, and you've done a great job planning it, but now you're thinking, okay, how the heck am I going to get PE into this? Well, there's so many great ways where you can incorporate it with a game, like a movement game. For example, the grade 2 standard for manipulative skills, throw a ball for distance using proper form, or roll a ball for distance using proper form. Okay, so you could easily think about a game that integrates these 2 standards into your ELA lesson, right? So maybe the students, as part of their ELA lesson, they're going to roll and throw a ball back and forth to each other as they say words that end in ing, right? And again, this seems small, and so maybe we can get into a more detailed one, like catch a gently thrown ball above the waist, reducing the impact force. Catch a ball thrown below the waist, reducing the impact force. This one has a little bit more of a range here, right, than just rolling the ball. So you might incorporate that into your integration plan, but you got to think, okay, how am I going to introduce how to catch a gently thrown ball below the waist? Okay, how am I going to introduce that? How am I going to model that? Okay, how am I going to structure a practice activity for them to do that? And then how am I going to assess it? When they're doing it during the ELA lesson, how am I going to assess that? Maybe you have a rubric that looks at how well they are able to catch the ball thrown below the waist without dropping, or catch the ball above the waist without dropping. Or maybe they are able to catch it, but they drop it sometimes, or they're unable to catch the ball from above the waist or below the waist. So it's really as simple as that, as thinking about the PE standard and focusing on how am I going to integrate that somehow into my lesson, and how am I going to structure a lesson objective that's built, a learning objective that's built around this standard. So if it was this one, it might say students will be able to catch a gently thrown ball above or below the waist, reducing the impact force, right? So you can add both of these standards here, that's fine. But really focusing on on modeling, introducing it, the concept, and modeling it, and then practicing it, in a group or in pairs with feedback from you, and then having an opportunity for them to be assessed after they've practiced it, right? It's not the same activity. It's after they've practiced it. Now it's like, now we're going to do it for real, and you can assess it. So there's a lot of physical ways you can incorporate a game or activities into ELA or math. And if this was like counting, you could really, counting by 5s or 10s, you could really incorporate a great movement game into it. There's lots of locomotor movement, jumping and skipping. I mean, there's so many great things you could do here. But there are also like things that are less bound by physical motion and activity, right? So let's go down here. Explain the fuel requirements of the body during physical activity and inactivity. So maybe you have a great science lesson that you can incorporate, you can connect it with the fuel requirements and nutrition of the body during physical activity, inactivity. But there's also like sociological concepts, right? Accept responsibility for one's own behavior in a group activity, right? So that's very much open, and I can imagine a scenario where similar to the health lesson one of the health lessons that we went over, where you're presenting scenarios where someone's unable to accept responsibility for their own group behavior in a group activity, and you're modeling that, and you give some examples, and the students respond to that, and then they write their own response to a different scenario, and you assess that. And maybe your ELA or your math lesson or whatever, maybe it has group work, and this is a skill that you want them to build before they really go into this group work. So that's a great integration. Demonstrate how to solve a problem with a person during physical activity. I mean, encourage others by using verbal and nonverbal communication. I mean, these are really broad, and they can fit into a lot of different lessons. So again, I'm very happy with a lot of the work that you all did in the health integration plan, and I want you to continue that. But I hope this video can help you to really beef up and improve your PE integration plans and improve your general lesson planning. I will send around a sign up for office hours for next week. And I realize that the work is due on Friday, and some of you have a new class starting on most of you, if not all of you, have a new class starting on Monday. So you might be wanting to get it done quickly. So if you have any questions anytime during the week, or you want to set up a meeting earlier than Wednesday at 1 o'clock for our office hours, please just reach out to me. I'll do my best to respond quickly and help you get the work done and get the time that you need to really put a great lesson plan together. So I hope this video is helpful. Again, reach out anytime. Good luck and have fun.